Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. We're coming to the end of Season 2 and I'm starting to plan for the next 2 seasons. Producing a podcast is not free and it takes time to get things right. So if you're enjoying this podcast and think it's worth $2 a month, please become a patron of the show. Just visit the website, foreigncountries.podbean.com, and click the Patron button. Thank you for your support. I'm taking a look at working class lifestyles in colonial and federal Australia. In a later episode I'll be talking about the Melbourne experience, but I'm starting with an unusual example of a Tasmanian penal colony that became a kind of model farm in the post-convict period. I'm joined now by Pamela Chauvel and Dr. James Flexner, both from the University of Sydney. They've just published a paper on this in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology, mapping difference in the uniform workers' cottages of Maria Island. So James, you and I and Catherine Freeman were running a project in Tasmania, and this particular piece of research was a kind of spin-off of that project.
This is kind of an extension of a multi-year archaeological excavation that was jointly run by the ANU and the University of Sydney in a place called Triabunna, which is the location of the British regiments that were defending the convict station at Maria Island from, I suppose, the convicts if they escaped. And while we were excavating there, we were taking students across to Maria Island, which is this incredibly stunning landscape, both in terms of its kind of natural beauty and in terms of its heritage. It's the Darlington Precinct is part of the UNESCO listing of Australian convict sites, but it also has this kind of overlay of 19th and 20th century working class heritage, which actually kind of parallels what was happening in Triabunna, where we were ostensibly looking for evidence about these soldiers who were stationed there during the convict period. But in fact, most of what we were looking at is the archaeology of 19th century and early 20th century rural life in remote areas of colonial Australia.
So Maria was set up as this farming community, logging as well, I think. But Pamela, it had this life after the end of the convict period.
And as I started to do the background reading before the research, it became clear that while there's been plenty of information about the convict period, there was less information about the industrial period. And so that's what really interested me.
So some of the penal buildings survived after the convict period. What do we know about what was there?
Yes, so the first convict settlement was in 1825. And this was really what established where the settlement would be, where the harbour is. And the only 2 buildings that remain from that period are the penitentiary, which was where they housed the convicts, and the commissariat building, which is, you see it when you first get off the ferry. It's now a visitor information centre. That lasted for about 8 years. Then there was a break, and then a new kind of convict management, which was the probation style, came in. And the probation style of management meant that the convicts would work their way up through the classes to get their freedom. And so the place where the penitentiary building is was enclosed into a quadrangle that was inward facing with a 2-storey building where the convicts were in individual cells. There were solitary cells and it was all very controlled. The enclosed quadrangle had the officers' buildings at the entrance to the quadrangle where they could surveil and make sure everyone was behaving themselves. And then on the distant hill, there was a hospital building, the religious instructor's house, and the main surgeon's house. So that was the main structure of the convict period. And this is what Bernardi inherited in the 1880s when he arrived.
Oh yeah, Diego Bernardi, the great Italian entrepreneur. Bernardi took out this lease on the island and tried to turn it into a sort of model farm, an agricultural community. As you know, I think he was a charlatan and a crook. He went bankrupt twice and disappeared with all the investors' money. But you've been looking into the philosophical background. So tell me what he was really like. What was he up to?
So one of the things that Pamela and I have speculated upon in various conversations is what models Bernardi might have been exposed to in his own life not only philosophically, in the writings of people like, say, Robert Owen or John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, the great British functionalist kind of economic thinkers, utilitarianist economic thinkers, but also just physically in terms of landscapes that he visited. There would have been these kinds of industrial landscapes that incorporated formalized workers' housing in parts of Europe where Bernanke had been, in Italy, in Switzerland, and possibly even in Britain as he was traveling. And so we wonder to what extent this would have then shaped his approach, because even though he kind of inherited this convict landscape, which showed changes in the philosophy of managing convicts as the emphasis went from punishment to reform, he then also constructed new areas such as the 12 Apostles, these row of uniform houses where we focused our research that were more a reflection of what was then the kind of contemporary thinking about how to manage the social spaces of the working class.
Before we get to the workers' housing he built, what did he do with the existing penal buildings?
So when Bernanke arrived on Maria Island, he took the religious instructor's house on the hill for his own house, and he adapted that, gave it a nice garden, put some grander steps at the front. Interestingly, he chose a convict building to live in, whereas the housing for his workers were all the new buildings that he built, and they were more uniform in style and had more of a sort of federation type cottagey look about them, and they were all very standardized in their design. The quadrangle he converted into sort of like a town square. So Bernanke got rid of the separate cells, he demolished those, and actually the bricks from those cells were used to create many of the other buildings. He retained most of the other buildings in the quadrangle and repurposed them as bakeries and a library for the workers and more accommodation for the single men. And the big mess hall for the convicts was also used as a mess hall for the workers.
Yeah, and the interpretation of that landscape is kind of interesting. So Pamela talks about the idea that Bernanke chose a convict building at a time when there was still quite a lot of cultural cringe around Tasmania's convict history, but it was a way of occupying a very prominent place on the landscape. The religious instructors' buildings up on a hill, up high, where you can kind of view all of the areas, not only where the workers in the settlement were living, but also where they were doing their industrial and agricultural activities, but also perhaps investing himself with a bit of authority as someone who could then draw on the history of the island as a part of his legitimacy, I suppose, as someone who was managing labor in that space.
So Bernanke brought his workforce to the island, but what was his big idea? What were the workers there to do?
So in 1884, Diego Bernanke got the lease for Maria Island at the princely sum of £1 a year, on the condition that he did at least £5,000 worth of improvements. And his plan was for sericulture and viticulture, as had not been seen in Tasmania to that point.
Silk and wine.
Yeah, so there's viticulture, which is the growing of vines to produce grapes and therefore wine. Sericulture is planting mulberry trees and then installing silkworms on the mulberry trees, harvesting the silk, and then using that to produce cloth.
And I think this was the romance of Bernanke's idea of himself. He renamed the island San Diego, and he liked to refer to himself as King Diego and have everyone see him as a bit of a father figure. I think his narrative was very much about the romance of the grape and the mulberry. But in actual fact, I think he also probably realised early on that he could utilise the limestone and make concrete, which was a bit more prosaic.
Now, you mentioned earlier the 12 Apostles, which are these 12 workers' cottages that your fieldwork was based on. You did some really detailed survey work on those.
If you visit Maria Island today and go and look for the 12 Apostles behind the settlement, all you'll see are a few brick footings, a couple of fireplaces in some of the buildings, and some retaining walls. So there's very scarce surface remains. But we quickly realised that there were differences in the yards behind the houses. So while the houses themselves had been built to a standardised design, the yards had differences between where the paths were, how the retaining walls had been constructed. So we set about mapping these. And the way we did these was with sketch plans and with total station.
Yeah, and there's sort of a reason why we use that multi-technique approach to mapping, because these different approaches produce different kinds of data. Total station, at least in the way that we were using it, produces 3D coordinate data, which is useful for certain things like modeling topography or looking at differences in elevation or height. While sketch mapping actually makes you sit down and look at the archaeology in front of you and think about what's there, and are you able to disentangle it in a way that allows you to, for example, record different contexts. And the idea is that the use of both of those techniques, and we also did 3D photogrammetry, but we'll set that to the side for now, allowed us to both have that kind of richness of the contextual data and the spatial precision and elevation data that are made possible by recording features with the total station.
So a single context recording, really detailed drawings, but you were looking to achieve more than just that.
We all know about the work that Ian Hodder and his colleagues did at Chauvel in the 90s about reflexive methodology, but the emphasis in that has always been on excavation techniques, excavation teams, their social dynamics, etc. One of the things we wanted to kind of push methodologically with this project was to be a bit self-reflexive about the cartographic process and to think about what are we using with these different techniques, what kinds of different information do they give us, how do we engage with them as embodied beings in addition to intellectually. And I think that's another side that can still be pushed a bit further. So the volume that this particular paper was published in was in a special issue of the International Journal of Historical Archaeology that's all about mapping in historical archaeology. And there's some really fantastic papers by some of the other authors in that volume that, again, are contributing to this growing conversation around not just how to make a good map, but really why and what are we representing in terms of narrative with the images that we produce. The other kind of really important thing that Pamela really did in the second field season of the project was to do what's called a single context recording of features in the rear yards of the houses. And what that did, again, was to kind of give a sense of all of the different ways that people assembled different kinds of architectural elements behind the house in order to achieve whatever purposes they were trying to achieve as different families and individuals moved in and out of these spaces.
And what were these individual people, these households, what were they doing with their houses?
So I think there's two things that are worth pointing to. Alongside the differences between the 12 houses, there's the interconnectivity of them and the kind of shared elements. So one of the things that seems to be a commonality is that across the houses, there is evidence that the main entry and exit point was the back door rather than the front door, which is a kind of pattern that's well known from working class houses at this time, right? If you're coming home from doing dirty work all day and you've got muddy boots, the first place you go is not through the front door to, tread your mud on grandmom's carpet. It's to the back so you can take your boots off and wash up before you enter the main space of the house. And the other thing that was quite common was to have these kind of pathways that formed connections between the houses, which were a kind of physical marker of having these 12 buildings kind of function as a coherent community of working class people.
Yeah, as a working class kid, I'm very familiar with the protocols of front door, back door, but it's not just functional.
As well as what James is saying about the back door being used to avoid trekking dirt through the house, it was also had a symbolic function, I suppose, as well, where important visitors like the vicar would knock at the front door, whereas friends and family would go to the back door. And interestingly, this is in contrast to Bernardi's house, where he definitely put the special new sandstone front steps for his visitors.
So in their materials and their spaces, were these households showing what individual choices?
There were side paths along the west side of the house running from the road to the back. And these are more visible in some houses than others. They've been edged in different ways. So I noticed that the main resources people were using was a lot of found materials, local stone, reused convict bricks, and also sometimes reused convict sandstone, which had obviously had another purpose but was brought into service as a step or a drainage feature in later times. The paths themselves were often edged with different materials. Sometimes it was sandstone, sometimes it was brick, sometimes it was found rocks. And there was evidence a little bit of different surfaces. There was a more gravelly surface or brick. Sometimes people have brought concrete into it.
So the fronts of the houses were visually similar and standard, but the backyards were very personal, family space.
In the backyards, each house had a retaining wall because there was quite a steep slope, and most of them were just dry stone walls with found rocks. But house number 2 actually had a very carefully formworked concrete retaining wall and steps leading up to it, where somebody had taken a lot more trouble to do a very neat and tidy back area and also steps up to the outer back area. Sometimes people had done repairs to their rear paths by adding extra layers of concrete, or they'd fixed up the drainage in certain ways, either a little bit of found sandstone from one of the convict buildings or putting a cover over a drain area. Just lots of small differences. People would seem to be doing them in the most cost-effective way that they could by just mostly reusing.
Now, your paper talks about mapping a working class creation of home. So how do you go about interpreting these similarities and differences?
I've been quite influenced by a lot of anarchist thinkers like James C. Scott, who's a US-based historian and anthropologist whose early work really focused on the lives of peasants and working people in Southeast Asia. And he talked about this idea of the weapons of the weak, which are, we tend to think of kind of working class resistance, particularly in archaeology, in terms of these major confrontations between labor and capital at places like Ludlow or Blair Mountain, which was the site of the largest coal miners' strike and subsequent battle with the US government in American history. And those are certainly important sites, but they're probably the minority of working class experiences. So one of the things I was interested in developing in the way we interpreted this data is thinking of what are the forms of working class kind of resistance that are available to people that aren't going on strike and taking up arms against their bosses, but actually the ways that simply everyday survival and the ability to carve out a comfortable and enjoyable life for yourself as a working class person is this really important way of resisting a system that in many ways maybe suggests that you don't deserve those kinds of things.
And a place to do that is often the backyards, because that's a little bit more out of sight, whereas the front of the house can retain this standardized appearance of respectability, but the rear yards can be modified and made into your own.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about it is it's done against a backdrop of one of these kind of contradictions in the paternalist ideology, which is on the one hand, you're expected to take care of your laborers if you're the boss of the operation, if you're Diego Bernardi. On the other hand, you're also trying to make as much profit as possible, which means you're not going to put the same amount of resources into your workers' houses as, say, you would your own house or the managers' houses, because there's also houses that Bernardi built for the kind of middle management at the site that's more elaborate and larger than what the laborers were living in. And I think that tension is kind of expressed in the fact that the houses themselves weren't quite enough for people, right? So they had to modify those yard areas in order to achieve what they thought of as a functional domestic space.
Right, so are you seeing working class resistance to the class structure? Or are these working class people using the structure to work their way up to improve their own lot?
I don't actually think that those two things are so easily disentangled. I don't think it's an either or of trying to make a better life for yourself or you're resisting the system. I think it's that those two things for working people often actually work hand in hand. Your ability to carve out an existence in ways that don't necessarily match the prevailing ideologies about what working class people are or how they live or should live can be a form of resistance. That's kind of how we've interpreted it, is the idea that, you know, using your resources and your time to carve out a different space for yourself than to the one that the boss has created for you is about trying to, as you say, improve your lot in life. But that also in doing so, you're resisting that kind of economic rationalism that says the workers should basically just survive so that they can contribute their labor to profiting whatever the business is.
And it also links back to what you were talking about earlier with the collective space behind, the way they linked up the backyards together in some ways and made these alternative paths and routes to things that suited themselves as a group as well as individuals.
And what's the next step for you now? Where does your research go from here?
My master's project had two aspects to it. It was a multi-scalar approach that looked at the landscape as a whole and also looked at the workers' housing. So I'd like to explore that a little bit further. The transformed landscape, so how the convict landscape was transformed into an industrial landscape. It does interest me, the idea of these small company towns that sprung up. Often in Australia, they were timber towns or mining towns. They might have been short-lived and then have sort of faded from view, and there's just these remnants behind. So I do find those landscapes really interesting and the people that lived in them. One of the valuable things I think about what we did was that often I find in historical archaeology there's a lot of focus on artefacts and excavation, and this demonstrated that doing a survey of the surface and careful mapping can also reveal a lot of information without the need for excavation.
For me, I think one of the things that this opens up topically, and not just for Australia, I also think it's really relevant to places like the North American West, for example, is the idea that early 20th century working class white people are maybe not as familiar as a lot of us imagine. I think we think about that period and we kind of assume that we understand what the working class was like and what their motivations were and how they lived and what they believed. And I think there's actually quite a lot to be done. There's a recent book by Charlotte Sinceri that's just been published about mining camps in California, I believe. There's so much more potential to these sites, and they have all of these little stories to tell that if you invest the time, you can get these kind of interesting patterns of behavior that aren't apparent from the dominant narratives that are produced by archaeologists and historians about these spaces.
Pamela Chauvel and James Flexner, thank you very much for joining me today. That brings us to the end of another episode. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries, please become a patron. Just visit the website foreigncountries.podbean.com and click the Patron button.